Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on this inaugural Zoom call of open primaries. We're all entering into uncharted waters here, which is both daunting and exciting. My name is John Opdyke. I'm the president of Open Primaries. I'm very pleased to have a chance to spend some time with all of you and with Glenn Burhans, who's the chair of All Voters Vote in Florida and the lead attorney behind the very expertly implemented legal effort to prevent the All Voters Vote measure from being sunk by our opponents in the courts. I'm going to just a few words about kind of how we're going to do today. So I'm going to interview Glenn, ask him some questions. Very quickly for doing that is if you have a question, go to the chat function, which you can find right on your screen. Enter your name, your state, and like a one-sentence description of kind of what in general you want to ask Glenn about. Then I'm going to call on you. I'm not going to ask your question. I'll say, hey, Ed from Tennessee has a question, Glenn, about this. We'll go to you. You'll be unmuted. You have to unmute yourself, then ask your question, and then put yourself back on mute. We all want to be on mute when we're not speaking to avoid reverb, feedback, and so forth and so on. Does that make sense? Everybody got that? Thumbs up? Okay. All right, good. So let me introduce all of you to Glenn Burhans. I've gotten to know Glenn over the last 3 years. He is a really, really sharp guy, both politically and legally. I was really most impressed with Glenn about 1.5 years ago when he was a participant in a televised town hall meeting that was put together by my colleague Jeremy Gruber and Spectrum Television on the west coast of Florida. It was an hour-long primetime event in which a television host interviewed people about the issue of open primaries. It was done in a brew pub in, I believe, Sarasota, Florida, or Tampa, Florida. It says something about the ripeness of the open primaries issue in Florida that you could get that televised in prime time on a cable network in Florida on the subject of open primaries. Very few states in which that editorial decision would be made by a local news agency. But Glenn is someone who, in my opinion, combines a deep political understanding of the need to open up the primaries and let all voters vote, and why this is such a problem in Florida, that the 3.7 million independent voters are locked out of meaningful participation. He combines that with a legal mind, the gate of efforts to from a good idea to a ballot that is now by the Secretary of State and just last week by the state Supreme Court of Florida. Glenn, I want to talk about that court ruling. The state Supreme Court, when it comes to ballot measures, their job is not to rule on the merit, but to rule whether A, it meets single subject, and B, whether the language proposed informs voters accurately about the meaning and the impact of the measure. So the court ruled 4-1 that it met that criteria. How did you feel about that ruling? What is that? What was that? How did that? Were you surprised at the outcome? Where were you in that process, and how did you feel about the ruling?
Well, first of all, John, thanks very much for having me on to speak to the folks across the country. And thanks to the people at Open Primaries, not only for today's opportunity, but the support that you've provided over the years has been fantastic. You, Jackie, uh, all the folks there. I remember the first summit we went to several years back where we first met and we talked about beginning this journey. So to come here now, several years later, with the Supreme Court victory is gratifying, but wouldn't be possible without the great team that we have around us, including you guys at Open Primaries and Steve Huff here on the ground in Florida as well. So thank you very much. Now to answer your question, I was ecstatic, obviously thrilled. I was literally shaking when I was opening up my email to read the decision. And you know, I've been practicing over 20 years, so there's very little I haven't seen as a lawyer. But this was a big moment because it's been such hard work to get here, as you know. We had some, you know, false starts and stops, but we had a great team come together, and believe me, I felt the weight of getting us across the goal line for the legal decision. So it was a feeling of being ecstatic, but also of great relief as well. And then realization now that the real work has to begin for the campaign.
Got it. Glenn, I want to flash on the screen the actual text of the ballot referendum so everyone can see it right now. Russell, can you put that up? Thanks, Russ. So this is the ballot title and the ballot summary that will be appearing on the November 2020 ballot in Florida. And I love it. All voters vote in primary elections for state legislature, governor, and cabinet. Allows all registered voters to vote in primaries for state legislature, governor, and cabinet, regardless of political party affiliation. All candidates for an office, including party-nominated candidates, appear on the same primary ballot. The two highest vote getters advance to general election. If two candidates find no primary is held and the winner is determined in the general election, candidates' party affiliation may appear on the ballot as provided by law, effective January 1, 2024. So Glenn, both the Democratic Party of Florida, the Republican Party of Florida, the elected Attorney General of Florida, they filed detailed legal briefs in an effort to kick this off the ballot, from preventing the court from saying the voters have a right to decide on this. Given that language, what did the Democrats and Republicans say was problematic with this and why it should be kicked off the ballot? What was the crux of their argument?
And this was a unique circumstance where the Republican and the Democratic parties were aligned in common cause. Unfortunately, it was to prevent all voters from voting in the state of Florida. And their biggest beef with the proposal is that they claimed that the ballot language failed to apprise voters that this would upend the centuries-long tradition in Florida of having closed party primaries. That was their primary argument. And obviously the court did not agree, because the language, and you saw the ballot language, you just read it for the folks on the call, it tells you how the new primary system will work. All candidates qualifying for an office appear on the same ballot. All voters get to vote regardless of their party affiliation. And then the top two advance to the general election. And so it's pretty clear how the new system will work. It's also very clear that any candidates nominated by a political party can appear on that primary ballot as well, and then compete to get into the general election. And that key phrase is what signals to voters that you can still have party nominations and that there can still be a party process outside of the all voters vote primary. But importantly, that's done by the parties themselves in their own time, preferably on their own dime. And the result of that is if they want to name their own candidates, they can do so. But that candidate has got to get through the gatekeeper election, the all voters vote primary.
In their ruling, did the court talk about that specifically? The ability of the parties to continue to conduct private nomination things, but just that it's separate from the formal government public process of that? did the court get into the weeds on that?
So a little bit, but it was done in a special concurrence by Justice Lawson. And if I can digress for a moment to give a little bit of background on where the Florida Supreme Court is now and how it's changed. Typically, we have 7 justices, but because 2 justices were recently nominated to a federal appellate bench, we are 2 justices short. We only have 5 right now. But we have seen with the new composition of the court is trying to grapple with tightening up the standards of review to get citizens' initiatives on the ballot. And so in this particular round in general for the 2020 crop, they have been ruling very narrowly on the ballot language and not straying off into different avenues of analysis. So the majority opinion that approved us for ballot placement did a very straightforward recitation of how we, number 1, meet single subject, and number 2, that the ballot language is not misleading to the voters. And they gave just a little bit of attention to those elements. And I don't mean to suggest that they gave the analysis short shrift. They didn't. They did a full analysis, but they weren't as expansive as,
Got it. Okay.
past decisions have been. Now, in his special concurrence, Justice Lawson was responding directly to the lone dissenter, Justice Muñoz. And Justice Muñoz had posited that the ballot language failed to identify, not only failed to identify that you could have this other process, but Justice Muñoz was arguing that the amendment language itself precluded that possibility. That's wrong. And Justice Lawson really set him straight and did a point-by-point rebuttal of each of the dissent's points, and did highlight the fact that the legislature, if they want, can provide for a separate nominating contest for the parties, or the parties on their own could have their own nominating contest. But the clear import of our amendment is, if you want to get to the general election, you've got to go through a primary where all the voters can vote, regardless of their affiliation.
Got it. Glenn, I want to open it up for questions now, but one before I do that, was there anything in the dissenting opinion that you found particularly interesting, whether it's related to this case, but overall in the broader political environment in Florida? Anything that was troubling or interesting to you at all?
Well, John, there was something that really jumped off the pages for me, and it was in Justice Muñoz's dissent, where he was arguing for what really is the new standard under Florida law. As you talked about at the beginning of the call, there's a 2-prong analysis for the Florida Supreme Court. Does it satisfy single subject? And does the ballot language disclose the amendment's chief purpose in a way that's not misleading to the average voter? Now, the Florida case law is clear. In disclosing the chief purpose, the Supreme Court has long held for 40 years that you don't have to describe every single permutation or possible effect of the amendment. And there's good reason for that, because we are limited to a 75-word ballot summary. So there's only so much you can say in 75 words. Now, our summary is 73 words, and the court agreed that we were clear. But Justice Muñoz was taking that chief purpose test and trying to make it different by claiming that the ballot language has to disclose all material legal effects of the amendment. So we go from chief purpose of the amendment to all material legal effects, which I don't think that gives any greater clarity, but it suggests that you have to disclose more of the legal ramifications of the amendment. Now, that gets into a question of what's material to a voter, and you start getting into kind of trying to psychoanalyze what a voter might find important. So I'm not troubled by it, because it was rejected by the majority and specifically addressed by Justice Lawson. But you know how appellate courts work. You start floating test balloons on legal theories in dissents or in concurrences. And the author hopes over time that it will be adopted by a majority view down the road. And in this case, the other reason why I found this attempt to posit a new standard that, in my view, would make it harder to craft ballot language that would pass muster, is that it's consistent with an attempt we've seen in Florida over the years now to limit the ability of the citizens to amend our Constitution through the Citizens Initiative. So, for example, last year, the 2019 legislature enacted House Bill 5, which created a raft of new regulations for the signature gathering process.
Right.
And really made it quite onerous, a little scary for signature gatherers, and some of the requirements and exposure to possible fines and things like that, burdensome record-keeping requirements, a lot of other things that will certainly drive up the cost significantly to have a petition campaign in Florida. And then in this most recent legislative session, which just concluded, more restrictions were enacted. For example, to get to ballot review by the Supreme Court, previously you had to get 10% of the necessary signatures, which is right now is about 79,000 signatures to satisfy the 10% requirement. And you had to get those signatures from 1/4 of the states. At that point, the Attorney General would make the request for the advisory opinion. Now you've got to get 25% of the signatures, and you've got to get it from half of the congressional districts in the state. So they're more than doubling what the requirements were.
Plus making petitioning harder. So it seems like they're.
When you combine all of that, it's just further hindering the Citizens Initiative process. And I can tell you, it's a matter of public record. It took $6 million for us to get the signatures. You know, all of our legal work was donated pro bono by my firm that we've been doing for years. Aside from having a strategic consultant who is very reasonably priced and an accountant, our only other cost item was the signature gathering, and that was a $6 million lift. That's going to be a lot higher, you know,
going forward, right?
Going forward. So that dissent just signaled to me and confirmed to me a concerted effort by conservative parties in Florida to make it more difficult to amend the Constitution by citizens' initiative.
Got it. All right, we have some questions. Just to remind everybody, if you have a question, go to the chat feature, put in your name, your state, and then a summary of your question, and then I'll call on you. I'm not going to ask your question for you. It just gives me an idea of the topic that you want to talk about. So the first question is from J.R. Denny. I presume that's John Denny from Pennsylvania. John, do you have a question? John, you have to unmute yourself.
There we go. Does that work?
Yep, that works.
So I was curious on the one part. Do I understand it correctly that, first of all, when is the election, what ballot question going to be on the ballot?
It's the November 3rd general election this year.
So if it passes, I might understand that, for example, local party committees like the Republican committee or the Democrat committee, they can, through their committee members, nominate a candidate for state legislature, and that candidate's name will appear on the primary ballot along with anybody else who gets on the ballot.
That's correct.
So that the parties then can have their own, in some ways, to their advantage, that could strengthen the party organizations because it gives them, you know, the ability to actually, as committee members, though I don't necessarily like the idea, but it gives them more power in selecting their own candidates to be on.
I think that's John, I think that's a reasonable analysis of that situation. It really depends upon what the parties come up with, if they are going to have their own separate process. But we have to allow them to have that process because they have a First Amendment right to freely associate with their own co-members, and they have the First Amendment right to pick their own champions for an election.
Mm-hmm. Good. Thank you.
But I think there's another way where all voters vote can help strengthen the parties, and that's simply by selecting candidates who speak to a greater majority of the voters, who speak to, you know, the vast majority of people in the middle of the two extremes of the parties in order to get out of the primary to the general election.
Can I just ask one quick follow-up, just make sure I understand? So if you're not, let's say, if the parties decide to nominate their own candidate on the ballot, and if you're not one of those candidates that get nominated by your local party to be on the ballot, do you only then have to get signatures from so many registered voters, regardless what party it is, to put your name on the ballot?
Well, everybody will have the exact same qualification requirements. So regardless of whether you're nominated by a party or you're not, you either have to pay the filing fee, which is X% of the annual salary for the position, or you have to get the minimum number of petitions for the relevant geographic area for the office. So that's the same whether you're picked by a party or not.
I see.
Okay, next question is from Cathy Stewart, who is the field director at The People and from New York. Cathy, you unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. Hi, Glenn. Thank you so much for doing this. And thank you, John and the crew at Open Primaries for giving us this opportunity. I wanted to ask you, and I know that the dust is just settling here, but given the tremendous support we've seen over many years now at the grassroots throughout the state for this issue, I wondered if you could speak to how you read the challenges that the campaign will face as you head towards the November ballot, and where you think the two parties are going to head now that they lost in court. Obviously, they wish they had won that round, but maybe if you could speak to how you see the campaign terrain.
So, the campaign terrain is going to be very interesting because of a few reasons. Number one, we don't know how long we're going to be feeling effects of the coronavirus situation. And by the way, I hope everybody's staying safe and is healthy and stays that way. But, that's going to shift maybe how we vote. People may be voting by mail by then, exclusively. I don't know. There's nothing in the works right now in Florida, but certainly that will have impact. We are going to have what I'm sure is going to be an extremely hard fought and divisive presidential election, which is, I think, going to suck up a lot of oxygen in the room. And that could cut both ways. That can help us kind of fly under the radar, or it might cause our messaging to get lost in that whirlwind. That's going to be a Force 5 hurricane. I think in Florida, because Florida is a swing state, so the party's going to be throwing a lot of money into the presidential. And if they decide that they want to pay attention to our race by throwing some money against that, that will be a challenge. In terms of messaging, that's just kind of the political landscape and the uncertainty that I think we're going to face. And of course, being able to effectively compete, money is always a factor because we want to be able to, get out digital and, be able to do mailings and, TV and radio. So that's just the typical campaign stuff. The other strategic stuff, I don't know how that will be impacted, but our message is very simple. And I think our message sells. Let all voters vote. It's really hard to argue with that. So I think as long as we can get the message out, and we may have to be a little creative, especially how we, educate and deploy our grassroots friends and resources, and be creative in how we might be using less traditional ways to get out the message and the vote, given just the climate we're in, so socially, economically, politically. It's a very different world now than it was, 30 days ago. And the campaigns, I think, will be different.
Yeah.
I hope that answered your question.
It did. Thank you, Glenn. Just a tiny quick follow-up. Does the measure pass with just over 50%?
60%.
60% needed. Okay, thank you.
And I can tell you, this election will see the most Floridians ever to vote. I think it's going to be 10 million easily that vote this time around. So we're going to need 6 million plus votes to get there. It's a big lift.
The next question comes from Bob Pearls from New Mexico. Bob.
Hi, it's nice to see everybody. I haven't seen many of you folks in several years. Just as an update, I've gone through some interesting transitions from being an independent activist to deciding to run a partisan campaign this year as the Sandoval County clerk, which is the local election official. Much of the reason I made that decision was because it turned out the statewide County Clerks Association has been pounding us on our open primaries legislation, ballot access legislation. And so I felt like I needed to jump back in the political fray. I'm a former state representative. And so that's been very interesting, being kind of trying to become an insider again in the Democratic Party, having been a very vocal, decline to state, as we call them in New Mexico, vocal independent activist for the last 5 years. So it's been interesting. On the legislative front, our open primaries legislation through the nonprofit I found in New Mexico Open Elections, which was originally called New Mexico Open Primaries, has continued to stall out. We've been taking a baby step approach out here in New Mexico just to allow independents to vote in partisan primaries. And so what I wanted to ask is, what was the decision that went into the Florida decision to go with top two versus what seems to be the new trend, top three, top four, with ranked choice voting in the general? If you don't mind commenting on that, I'd love to hear anybody's decision on that, because my group's in the throes of deciding what our legislative agenda is going to be for the 2021 session in January here in New Mexico.
Okay, Bob, thank you. By the way, good luck with your campaign. They're tough. And thanks for the question. We actually spent this has been a 5-year effort for us so far. We spent a lot of time analyzing the type of primary system we thought could make it in Florida in a few respects. Now, I'll tell you, we started with doing an exhaustive 50-state survey of existing primary systems around the country. And we were looking at emerging ones such as ranked choice and things like that. And then we did an overlay of a couple different types of analysis. Number one, would it pass Supreme Court review to get on the ballot? And so we'd have to be able to craft an amendment that would satisfy the single subject requirement and also be explainable in a 75-word summary that disclosed the chief purpose and was not misleading to the voters. So we had that framework in mind as well. But then we also had a US constitutional law framework to make sure that whatever we proposed would withstand US constitutional scrutiny in the event that we made it on the ballot, we were approved, and then there was a subsequent litigation challenge. And then we also looked at Florida law to figure out whether would there be Florida law or Florida constitutional challenges that could be brought after the fact. And then the last thing we considered was making it, to the best extent we could, bulletproof, so that if it was passed and had to be implemented by the Florida legislature, it couldn't be monkeyed with. And that's something that's difficult in Florida, because the legislature is, and I'm not trying to get into partisan politics, but it's dominated by a very conservative Republican Party here in Florida, and they don't like to implement popular constitutional amendments that are passed by the citizens. And I can, cite the example of Amendment 4 a couple of years ago, which was the restoration of voting rights for certain felons who had served their full term and things like that. Well, that was passed in 2018, and we've been litigating that issue now for a couple of years. It's gone up to the Supreme Court. It's been in federal court because the legislature, in implementing it, was drawing a hard line on that. In order to complete the terms of sentence, any type of restitution and court fees had to be paid first, which, if you've just come out of jail and don't have a job and don't have any money, how are you going to pay that stuff? So a federal court here actually found that was unconstitutional. That's working its way through the appellate process. So that's a long way of saying we had a few different lenses to look through. Number one, could we get it on the ballot? Would it pass US constitutional, Florida constitutional law challenges? And would the Florida voters adopt it? And that piece of it, we were bolstered by polling where we polled different options. And so when we put all that together, it was really the top two model that checked off all the boxes in the strongest way possible that we felt would get us where we need to be.
Got it. All right, we got a lot of questions here. I'm going to plow through them as quickly as I can. We have a question from Ernie Boch from Florida. Ernie? Ernie, you have to unmute yourself. No? Okay.
I'm actually reading his question, and it says, what specific reason has caused the effective date to be delayed until 2024? Is that the question?
Yep.
Okay. So that's actually a fascinating story because we were going to make it effective come the next election. But, as we've talked to different leaders around the state, election reformers, current elected officials, former elected officials, a lot of people come out in support of this privately, but especially people who are involved in the process, office holders or lobbyists, people like that. They don't want to go on record because it can hurt their interests at the governor's mansion or at the legislature. But in talking to some recent office holders, a common theme we found was that if we wanted to keep elected officials, current elected office holders, on the sidelines without coming out against us, we should consider pushing back the effective date where their view would be it really wouldn't have impact on them because they'll be moving on to the next thing and not so concerned. So that's why we decided to push it off based upon that feedback from different former politicos.
Got it. All right, a question from Jose Torres. Jose, where are you from?
Jacksonville, Florida.
You're from Texas via Florida?
Jacksonville, Florida.
Oh, Jacksonville, Florida. Sorry, I misunderstood you. Go ahead. What's your question?
So I was just wondering, how is this going to, I know that one of the biggest things I've been reading up on the court cases, obviously here, and one of the big things that this Justice Muñiz was worried about was how the parties were going to elect we're going to select their candidates, but it seems to me counterproductive to pretty much open up the election to just about anybody who can register and pay the fee, and yet only have one from Democrat and one from Republican Party. I was just wondering what his thoughts were on this.
Well, the current system now allows for anybody that meets the qualifying criteria, among them, obviously being the minimum age and being a resident, being a citizen. If you pay the qualifying fee or get the signatures, you qualify. So that's not affected by the All Voters Vote Amendment. And in terms of appearing on the ballot, it's not just limited to one Republican or Democrat. Your party affiliation can be reflected on the ballot, and that serves an important communication device because some people like to know which party somebody's affiliated with because that will give kind of a signal as to certain maybe core political or ideological beliefs. So under our amendment, party affiliations, now that is subject to the legislature, and we deferred that decision as to whether or how you put party affiliation on the ballot so as to avoid a separation of powers / multiple subject issue, because as I noted earlier, the single subject requirement to get on the ballot in Florida requires that the amendment not perform multiple functions of the different branches of government. And so we didn't want to take over a task of the legislature and run the risk of being rejected on the single subject violation. So now, as a practical matter, if the parties each select their own nominee to appear on the all voters vote ballot, you will have one formal Republican nominee, one formal Democrat nominee. Now, I suspect what you might see in the ballot language would be something like you see in other states where it says, prefers Republican or prefers Democrat, or, registered Republican, registered Democrat, something like that, that will enable candidates to have their party affiliation on the ballot so that voters can see who they might be aligned with.
It will be interesting to see if the ones chosen by the parties get the most votes or the least votes overall, now that everybody's going to be able to vote.
You know, Jose, on that point, they've had the top two system now in California for a decade. And there's some very interesting research coming out of USC that shows that while, as expected, candidates that are endorsed by their party establishment do well because they tend to have more money, more endorsements, more kind of connections, that it is in some races, increasing number of races, it actually is counterproductive. That voters in this political environment are looking for outsiders, insurgents, people that are not part of kind of established political machinery. And candidates that are not endorsed are doing very well. So the top two system, if California is any indicator, is going to benefit and help insurgent candidates, outsider candidates, and that's part of the importance of it. Even as parties, even as parties will still have the right to make endorsements, that becomes a private activity. That's something the parties can do on their, as Glenn was saying, on their own dime and at their own time. The public ballot, that's the property of the people.
Well, is it really going to be on their own dime?
Well, that'll have to get worked out.
Yeah.
But
I mean, my point is, since Republicans and Democrats pretty much own Tallahassee here, I assume they're going to probably push for public money again.
They may very well do that.
That's just local.
I agree with you, Jose. I think there's a chance that they'll do that. I think that will be a hard sell to the public that they want to have a second taxpayer-funded system for these closed primaries when voters voted in, if we win, voted in the top two process. And I think it's going to be particularly difficult when we forecast next legislative session. The state of Florida, its economy is going to be in a very different place than it is now. The state budget's going to be in a very different place now. I don't know that there'll be much political appetite to propose that, let alone get it passed. But you are absolutely right. That is a possibility, and it could happen.
The other thing, Jose, is that the top two system is currently used in Florida in all 421 of the state's municipalities. It's used for elections to school board. It's used in, mayors and city council elections. It's county officials like sheriff. And in those situations, you have a primary. The top two go to the general election. All the candidates enter. It's the same system that All Voters Vote is proposing. And there is no supplementary taxpayer-funded partisan primary system to come up with endorsements. The parties just do that on their own. They endorse who they want. The candidates put it on their literature. Everyone knows who's been endorsed by the party organization, but the taxpayers don't fund a separate process to come up with that.
I believe that's because those are nonpartisan seats. Is that correct?
Some municipalities, it's nonpartisan. Some it is partisan. It kind of varies.
Okay.
Yeah, for example, our friend from, are you from Jacksonville, Jose?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so City of Jacksonville does it in a partisan fashion. And they've got a similar setup. So, and John highlights a really interesting point, and this goes back to a prior question. One of the arguments made by the political parties in opposition was that, well, this is so new and it's foreign and nobody's going to understand it. And in our reply brief, we pointed out what John just said. We've got over 400 municipalities and numerous county level races that use this every single cycle. It's really something that all Florida voters are doing already anyway.
They're just throwing things on the wall to see what sticks.
Yeah.
Well, that was my view.
Thank you.
All right, we got a few more minutes here. We have a question from Nancy Hanks from Independent Pennsylvanians. Nancy.
Hi, thanks for doing this, John. My question was sort of a follow-up to Cathy Stewart's earlier about the campaigning to get this now that it's on the ballot, to get it passed by the voters. what kind of infrastructure has been built off of this massive, very successful petitioning drive?
Well, the infrastructure is more at kind of a higher level than a grassroots at this point, because we did use paid petition circulators to a large extent. We had some help, for example, from the League of Women Voters, and they worked really hard. But when you've got to get 1 million signatures in Florida to make sure you have enough, we use paid circulators, many of whom are from outside the state, and they don't stick around to work on follow-up campaigns. So if that's the nature of your question, we've got a campaign management team. We've got a political consultant / campaign manager, people that can prepare content and things like that. We've set up an infrastructure to meet with the editorial boards around the state, things like that. But we don't have, we've got a good relation with Steve Huff and his Florida organization. So I'm anticipating that group will have a pretty big role in helping us bring the message to all of the different markets of Florida on the ground.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
All right, we have time for one more question. That's from Joseph Colmer. Joseph, where are you from? Joseph, you there?
Oh.
Hello, Joseph?
He's got to unmute.
Joseph, you got to unmute yourself.
Yes, now? Is it okay?
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Where are you from, Joseph? Where are you from?
I was from Spain, but I've been living here for 12 years already. And
What state? Where do you live?
In Washington, D.C. Let me introduce myself just a moment, because it's the first time that I connect with your group. I'm a professor of political science at Georgetown University here in Washington. And I published a lot about voting rules, electoral systems all across the world. And I'm strongly interested in this, and I would like to cooperate with you if you think it's worth it in the future. And then my motivation is that, so the plurality rule, which is the most common rule in the US, right, is the worst in the world. I mean, the worst possible electoral rule. And then now I like that there are two, because it promotes polarization, and so extreme candidates can win, etc. And then I see two alternatives. One is the ranked choice voting, that I know the people who are promoting this very well. We have a lot of meetings, discussions, and I think it's not good, because it's too complicated. People cannot understand how it works. It also tends to produce rather more or less consensual winners, but it's not always the same as the top two runoff. And it's very costly to implement. I organized a meeting a few months ago. People in Maine that recently introduced RCV were kind of disappointed, because it was more difficult to implement the rule that they expected, and people were a little cross about it. And then, so I like to top two runoff, because I think people can understand. It's very intuitive. It's very popular. Now it's used in many more states and many, many more cities than RCV by far. I think it's the future. I think it's the alternative to support. And then I have two friends in Florida who are donors for the campaign, by the way, and they contacted me and we talked a little about it. And then now I'm working with a couple of people in Washington, in DC, who are candidates for the council, for the city council. And so we try to also to discuss with RCV on to runoff. I have a question anyway, but in this case, let me just illustrate the point. In my ward, there is, DC is about 90% Democrat.
Right.
And the DC primary in June, in principle. And then for the city council. In my ward, there are 7 candidates for one single office. And one of them is the most rejected one, because it's the office holder who was involved in the scandal, etc. But he might win because with 7 candidates. So that's terrible. So several of those candidates are very open to support these other alternatives in the future. My point about Florida is just one question. why you didn't consider federal offices as well as it was in California and Louisiana and many other places?
Yes. Thank you, Professor. And by the way, Carlos de la Cruz speaks very highly of you and your work.
Oh, I know him then. Okay.
Yes, thank you. Yes. So why didn't we? Well, we did consider federal offices, but I go back to the Florida unique requirement to get on ballot, which is the single subject requirement. And if we had combined state office with federal office, we were susceptible, very susceptible to a single subject violation. So we split them into two petitions, and we actually started this journey by having both petitions out in the field. Unfortunately, we couldn't raise enough money to run two petitions, so we figured, well, what's going to have the greatest immediate impact for Floridians, and we decided it would be at the state office level. So we ran with the state petition. We still have the federal petition in our back pocket, depending on how this campaign goes, and if we can raise money for a future campaign and we get support for it, then I think we would take a shot at running the federal one as well.
Okay, good news. Thank you.
Thank you for that question.
Thanks, Joseph. All right, that's all the time that we have. I'm going to thank you all for joining. I'm sure we could talk for another hour, but this is the time we've got with Glenn, who's a busy guy. Before we go, we have a 2-minute little campaign cartoon, which we want to show everybody. This has been, we put this together a couple weeks ago, and it's been circulating around the country, kind of designed to give people the facts about the all voters vote measure. Enjoy, and we'll see you and hear you on our next call. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
John. Thanks all. Enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thank you.
The idea is called top two primaries. It's simple but different.
What's being proposed, Susan? Break it down for me.
Well, Bill, it's a new kind of primary system. Instead of holding Republican and Democratic primaries, the state would just hold one big open primary where everyone gets to vote and all the candidates run.
What happens after everyone votes in the primary?
The top two vote getters advance to the general election.
Oh, so that's why we call it top two.
You are very smart, Bill.
So what happens to the Republican and Democratic primaries?
They vanish.
In the Wittgensteinian sense?
That is an oddly postmodern philosophical reference, but yes, the problem vanishes.
I've heard some Democrats say, I don't want Republicans voting in my primaries, and vice versa.
Those people are confused. Under this system, there are no partisan primaries, just one big wide open one. Everyone gets to participate, including the 3.6 million independent voters in Florida.
There's that many independents?
Yes, independents are almost 30% of all Florida voters, and the number keeps going up every year. 50% of voters under 30 are independents. I'm an independent.
But wait, what if I really want my party to hold a members-only primary? Don't we have that right?
You still can. You just have to pay for it yourself.
Who pays for the primaries now?
We do, the taxpayers, even independents who aren't allowed to vote in them.
That doesn't seem fair.
It's not. It's taxation without electoralization.
Is electoralization a real word?
No, but it rhymed, Bill, so cut me some slack.
So in the top two system, could the general election feature two Democrats or two Republicans?
Yep.
That seems weird.
Weird can be good. I used to think oysters were weird. Now I love them.
You know what I mean.
I do, but think about it. If one party has 3 good candidates and the other party has just one doofus, why should the doofus be guaranteed a spot in the finals?
I am anti-doofus.
Me too. This is a way to allow the 2 best candidates to advance, regardless of party.
Does anyone else do it this way?
Yes. California, Nebraska, and Washington all use the top 2 system. It works well there. Voters like it.
Who favors this idea?
Me.
Who else?
Am I not enough of a reason?
Not really.
Ouch. But I understand. Voters like it. Polls here in Florida show that somewhere between 60 and 75% of Floridians want this. The support is across the board. Democrats, Republicans, and independent voters. The League of Women Voters, Florida Fair and Open Primaries, and the national group Open Primaries have endorsed.
Who hates it?
Democratic and Republican insiders. Even though their members like it, party bigwigs don't like change of any kind, especially this kind of change that lessens their control of the process. You know what I mean? Both parties submitted 40-page legal briefs to try to keep this from even appearing on the ballot next year. They really don't like it.
So voters are intrigued, but the politicians don't like it and want to keep it off the ballot.
That about sums it up. And that's a good sign in my book. No more built-in advantage for parties. No more guaranteed spots in the finals for candidates who stink. Everyone gets to vote in every taxpayer-funded election for whomever they want.
What if I don't believe anything you said?
Then you just hurt my feelings again. But you can read the amendment for yourself at dos.elections.myflorida.com and check out the campaign website at allvotersvote.org.
Thanks for allowing me to say Wittgenstein.
No problem, Bill.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.